The security guards gripped the elderly homeless man's arms as they dragged him across the marble floor of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital, one of the city's most prestigious medical centers. Thomas Wright, his clothes tattered and face weathered by years on the streets, didn't struggle against their hold. He simply maintained his dignity as dozens of well-dressed patients and staff members watched in uncomfortable silence. The head of hospital administration stood nearby, straightening his expensive red tie with satisfaction, confident he had protected the hospital's exclusive image from someone who clearly didn't belong. But what none of them knew, what they couldn't have possibly imagined as they forced the old man through the revolving doors into the cold afternoon, was that he was the father of their chief of cardiology. Hours later, the truth would emerge, and nothing would ever be the same. St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital stood like a monument to modern medicine in the heart of the city's most affluent district, its glass and steel facade reflecting the afternoon sun in brilliant sheets of light. The building itself seemed to announce its prestige, with its towering entrance adorned by the names of wealthy benefactors carved into polished granite, each letter a testament to the exclusivity that had become the hospital's unspoken motto. Inside the main lobby, the atmosphere was more akin to a five-star hotel than a medical facility. The floor was imported Italian marble, its surface so perfectly polished that it reflected the faces of those who walked across it like a mirror. Original paintings lined the walls, museum-quality pieces that had been donated by grateful patients who could afford such generosity. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, catching the light and scattering it across the space in tiny rainbows. Catherine's whispered wealth, from the leather chairs in the waiting area to the fresh orchids that sat on every surface, their delicate blooms replaced daily by the hospital's landscaping staff. The patients who filled the lobby matched the surroundings perfectly. Women in designer clothes sat flipping through magazines, their jewelry catching the light. Men in tailored suits checked expensive watches and answered calls on the latest smartphones. Even the staff seemed chosen to fit the aesthetic, moving through the space with practiced grace, their uniforms crisp and professional. Into this world of gleaming surfaces and quiet wealth walked Thomas Wright, and he might as well have stepped through a portal from another dimension. Thomas was 72 years old. Though the streets had aged him in ways that made him look closer to 80. His face was weathered and deeply lined, carved by too many nights sleeping in doorways and too many days wondering where his next meal would come from. His hair was long and gray, pulled back into a ponytail that he had tied with a piece of string he had found. His clothes told the story of his life more eloquently than words ever could. He wore a coat that had once been brown, but was now an indeterminate color, stained and worn thin at the elbows. Beneath it, layers of shirts and sweaters created bulk against the cold, each piece donated or found, none of them matching. His pants were held up with a rope belt, and his shoes were held together with duct tape, the soles separating from the uppers with each step. But despite everything, despite the obvious poverty that clung to him like a second skin, Thomas Wright's eyes remained kind. They were a clear blue, surprising in their brightness against his weathered face, and they held a gentleness that years of hardship had not managed to extinguish. He stood just inside the entrance for a long moment, taking in the grandeur around him, his hands clutching a worn canvas bag that held everything he owned in the world. He took a deep breath, feeling the persistent cough that had brought him here tighten in his chest, and then he moved forward with quiet determination toward the reception desk, his taped shoes making soft sounds against the marble floor. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. From his office on the second floor, Gerald Hutchinson had a perfect view of the lobby below, and he made a point of spending at least 20 minutes each afternoon observing the comings and goings of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital. It was part of what he considered his duty as head of hospital administration, this watchful oversight of the institution he had helped build into one of the most exclusive medical centers in the region. Gerald was 53 years old and looked every bit the successful executive he believed himself to be. His suit was custom-tailored from a shop in London that he visited twice a year, specifically for this purpose. the charcoal gray fabric cut to perfection across his shoulders and falling in precise lines down his frame. His shoes were Italian leather, polished to a mirror shine each morning by his own hand, a ritual he performed while listening to the financial news. But it was his tie that truly defined him. A silk piece in a deep crimson red that had become his signature over the years. Everyone at Street Catherine's knew Gerald Hutchinson by his red tie, and he wore it with the pride of a peacock displaying its feathers. He stood at his window now, a cup of expensive coffee in one hand, surveying his domain with the satisfaction of a man who had achieved exactly what he set out to achieve in life. Street Catherine's was his creation as much as anyone's, and he took personal responsibility for its reputation. Under his leadership, the hospital had transformed from a respected medical center into an exclusive destination for the wealthy and powerful. Celebrities came here for their procedures. Politicians trusted their health to Street Catherine's doctors. The waiting list for non-emergency appointments stretched months into the future, and Gerald made sure that every single person who walked through those doors looked the part, fit the image, belonged to the world that Street Catherine's represented. So, when his eyes fell upon Thomas Wright shuffling across the marble floor toward the reception desk, Gerald felt something cold and sharp twist in his stomach. The old homeless man stood out like a stain on white linen, his ragged appearance a jarring contrast to everything Gerald had worked to create. He watched as Thomas approached the desk, as heads turned and eyes followed his progress. Gerald could practically feel the discomfort rippling through the lobby, could sense the unease of the well-dressed patients who had paid premium prices to be treated in an environment that reflected their status. He set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, straightened his red tie, and made his way toward the door. This was exactly the kind of situation he was paid to handle. The kind of problem that required a firm hand and clear boundaries. As Gerald descended the stairs with measured steps, his mind was already forming the words he would use. The polite but unmistakable dismissal that would restore order to his lobby. Meanwhile, at the reception desk, a very different interaction was taking place. Sarah Mitchell was 26 years old and had been working at Street Catherine's for just over a year as a triage nurse in the emergency department. She had been passing through the lobby on her way to her shift when she noticed Thomas approaching the desk and saw the receptionist's expression shift from professional courtesy to barely concealed disdain. Sarah had grown up in a working-class neighborhood where everyone knew what it meant to struggle, and she recognized in Thomas something that the polished surfaces of Street Catherine's tried very hard to hide: simple human need. She stepped forward before the receptionist could speak and offered Thomas a warm smile. Her voice was gentle as she asked how she could help him. And when Thomas explained in a quiet, dignified voice that he had an appointment and needed to fill out intake forms, Sarah immediately retrieved the clipboard and pen, guiding him to a chair in a quieter corner of the lobby where he could complete the paperwork with some privacy. Gerald reached the corner of the lobby where Sarah had settled Thomas just as the old man was beginning to fill out the intake forms, his weathered hands gripping the pen with the careful concentration of someone for whom such tasks had become unfamiliar. Gerald's footsteps were sharp against the marble, announcing his approach with the confidence of someone who knew his authority was absolute within these walls. Sarah looked up as he arrived, and something in her expression shifted. A wariness entering her eyes as she recognized the head of hospital administration bearing down on them with clear purpose written across his face. Gerald ignored her completely, his attention fixed entirely on Thomas, his gaze sweeping over the tattered clothing and worn shoes with an assessment that was both swift and damning. He cleared his throat, a sound calculated to command attention, and when he spoke his voice carried across the quiet lobby with unmistakable authority. "Excuse me," he said, though there was no genuine politeness in the words. Only the thin veneer of professional courtesy stretched over something far less kind. "I'm Gerald Hutchinson, head of hospital administration, and I need to understand what's happening here." Thomas looked up from his forms, meeting Gerald's eyes with a steadiness that seemed to irritate the administrator even more. "I'm filling out paperwork for my appointment, sir," Thomas replied, his voice quiet but clear, roughened by years and the persistent cough that rattled in his chest. Gerald's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as he glanced at Sarah with clear disapproval. "An appointment," he repeated, loading the words with skepticism. "I see. And tell me, do you have insurance? Do you have any way to pay for services at Street Catherine's? Our facility operates at a certain level, you understand. And we need to ensure that patients can meet their financial obligations." Sarah started to interject, her face flushing with embarrassment at Gerald's tone, but he held up one hand to silence her without even looking in her direction. Thomas remained calm, though something flickered in those kind blue eyes, a hurt that he quickly pushed down. "I can pay, sir," he said with quiet dignity. "My daughter arranged everything. I have an appointment at 2 o'clock with Dr. Elizabeth Wright in cardiology." Gerald's expression shifted to something that looked almost like amusement, a condescending smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Dr. Wright," he said, drawing out the name as though savoring a private joke. "Our chief of cardiology, one of the most respected cardiac surgeons in the country. And you're telling me that you have an appointment with her?" Thomas nodded slowly, his hands still gripping the clipboard. "Yes, sir, that's correct." Gerald actually laughed then, a short bark of sound that caused several nearby patients to look over with curious expressions. "Sir, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding," Gerald said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Dr. Wright's calendar is booked months in advance with patients who require her very specific expertise. I'm sure whatever free clinic or community health center you meant to go to probably has someone named Wright working there." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as though sharing confidential information. "But this is Street Catherine's Memorial Hospital. We specialize in complex cardiac procedures for patients with comprehensive insurance coverage or the means to pay privately. Perhaps you'd be better served at County General? They have an excellent charity care program for people in your situation." The condescension in those last 3 words hung in the air like smoke. Thomas took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as that persistent cough threatened to surface. "Mr. Hutchinson," he said carefully, "I understand how this must look, but I assure you I have an appointment. My daughter, she's been trying to help me, and this was the first step. She works here." Gerald straightened up, adjusting his red tie with one hand. "Your daughter works here," he repeated flatly. "In what capacity? Housekeeping? Kitchen staff?" Thomas opened his mouth to respond. But Gerald was already turning away, gesturing to Sarah with visible irritation. "Miss Mitchell, I appreciate your compassion, but this is exactly the kind of situation that requires administrative intervention. We cannot have individuals who clearly cannot afford our services taking up space in our waiting areas and consuming resources that should be directed toward our actual patient population." By now, the confrontation had drawn the attention of nearly everyone in the lobby. Conversations had stopped, magazines lay forgotten in laps, and all eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding in the corner, where Thomas sat with his clipboard and his dignity, facing down the administrator in the expensive suit with the red tie. Gerald's voice rose sharply, cutting through the hushed atmosphere of the lobby like a knife, and there was no mistaking the intention behind it now. This was no longer a private conversation but a public declaration, a statement meant to be heard and understood by everyone present. "Sir, I need you to be honest with me," Gerald said, his tone shifting from condescending to openly accusatory. "Are you lost? Are you confused about where you are? This is Street Catherine's Memorial Hospital, one of the premier medical facilities in this city, not a shelter or a soup kitchen. People like you don't belong here." The words hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable in their meaning. Sarah gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth as she took an involuntary step back, shocked by the naked cruelty of the statement. Several of the watching patients shifted uncomfortably in their seats, though whether from disapproval of Gerald's words or agreement with his sentiment was impossible to tell. Thomas remained seated, his weathered hands still holding the clipboard. And though his jaw tightened slightly, his voice, when he spoke, was still calm, still measured. "I have an appointment," he repeated, each word careful and clear. "At 2 o'clock. With Dr. Elizabeth Wright, Chief of Cardiology. She's expecting me. Gerald threw his hands up in a gesture of exasperation that was clearly performed for the audience that had gathered. This is absurd, he declared, looking around at the watching faces as though seeking their validation. Dr. Wright treats senators, business leaders, people who contribute significantly to this institution. The idea that she would have a personal appointment with someone who appears to be homeless is not just unlikely, it's impossible. He turned back to Thomas, his expression hardening further. I don't know what confusion brought you to our doors, but I'm telling you clearly and directly that you need to leave. There are facilities better equipped to handle your needs. County General has social workers who can help you. There are free clinics throughout the city. But you cannot stay here. Thomas met his gaze steadily, and when he spoke there was a quiet strength in his voice that somehow made Gerald even angrier. I am not confused, Mr. Hutchinson, Thomas said. I know exactly where I am. My daughter works here. She is Dr. Elizabeth Wright. She scheduled this appointment for me herself. She wanted to make sure I received proper care for this cough that won't go away. She wanted to help me. Gerald's face flushed red, and his voice climbed another notch in volume. That's enough. I don't know if you're experiencing some kind of mental health crisis, or if this is an elaborate con, but I will not stand here and listen to you claim a relationship with one of our most distinguished physicians. Dr. Wright would never, he emphasized the word with contempt, have a father living on the streets. The implication was clear and cruel. Sarah found her voice finally, stepping forward with her hands raised in a placating gesture. Mr. Hutchinson, please, she said, her voice shaking slightly. Maybe we should just verify the appointment. It would only take a moment to check the system or call Dr. Wright's office. We don't need to make this into such a scene. Gerald rounded on her with fury in his eyes. Miss Mitchell, you are overstepping your authority, he said sharply. This is an administrative matter, and I am handling it. Your compassion is misplaced. This man is clearly fabricating stories, and your willingness to believe him shows exactly the kind of naivety that allows people to take advantage of institutions like ours. He turned back to the lobby at large, addressing the watching crowd now as much as Thomas. Street Catherine's has a reputation to uphold, he announced, his voice ringing with self-righteous authority. We have standards, expectations, a certain class of clientele that we serve. When we allow those standards to slip, when we permit anyone to simply walk in off the street and make demands, we devalue what makes this institution special. We owe it to our real patients, the people who actually belong here, to maintain these boundaries. Thomas stood up slowly, his movements dignified despite the tremor in his hands. He faced Gerald directly, and though he was several inches shorter than the administrator and his clothing marked him as someone from an entirely different world, there was something unshakable in his bearing. I am not lying, he said quietly. I have an appointment. I am Dr. Elizabeth Wright's father, and I would appreciate being treated with basic human respect. Gerald's eyes narrowed dangerously, and his hand moved to straighten his red tie once more, a gesture that had become almost reflexive. Basic respect is earned, he said coldly, and right now, all I see is someone who refuses to accept reality. Someone who is causing a disturbance in my hospital and making our legitimate patients uncomfortable. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. I'm calling security, he announced. You've been asked to leave. Now, you'll be escorted out. Gerald's fingers moved across his phone screen with swift, decisive movements, and within seconds he had made the call that would seal Thomas's fate. His voice was clipped and professional as he spoke into the phone, requesting security to the main lobby immediately, citing a disturbance that required removal. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, then crossed his arms over his chest and fixed Thomas with a look of cold satisfaction, the look of a man who had restored order to a situation that had threatened to spiral out of control. The silence in the lobby was absolute now, heavy and uncomfortable, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of a telephone ringing somewhere in the building's depths. Every eye was fixed on the tableau before them. This confrontation between the impeccably dressed administrator and the homeless man who refused to leave, Some of the watching faces showed sympathy, others showed discomfort, and still others showed a kind of grim approval. As though Gerald was doing something unpleasant but necessary, something that someone had to do to maintain the natural order of things. Sarah stood frozen beside Thomas, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her face pale with distress and anger. "Mr. Hutchinson, this isn't right." She tried again, her voice urgent now. "Please, just let me call Dr. Wright's office. This can all be cleared up in 2 minutes." One phone call. Gerald didn't even look at her. "The matter is closed, Miss Mitchell," he said flatly. "I suggest you return to your duties before you find yourself facing disciplinary action for insubordination." The words were a clear threat, and Sarah flinched as though she had been struck. But she didn't move from Thomas's side. The elevator doors at the far end of the lobby chimed open, and 2 security guards emerged, both of them large men in dark uniforms with radios clipped to their belts. They crossed the marble floor with purposeful strides, their rubber-soled shoes squeaking slightly against the polished surface. Gerald gestured toward Thomas with one hand, his expression grave and official. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of unquestionable authority. "This individual has been asked to leave the premises and has refused. He's claiming to have an appointment that doesn't exist and making our patients uncomfortable. Please escort him out of the building." Thomas's weathered face remained calm, though his hands trembled slightly as he reached into the pocket of his tattered coat. "Please," he said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I have documentation. I can show you. I have papers that prove my appointment. My daughter gave me everything I need. Just let me show you." He began to pull out his worn leather wallet, the edges frayed and the leather cracked with age. But Gerald moved forward quickly and caught his wrist. "Don't," Gerald said sharply, his voice rising again. "Don't reach into your pockets. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. You've already caused enough of a disturbance. Whatever story you're about to tell, whatever fake documents you think you have, I'm not interested." The 2 security guards moved to either side of Thomas, their presence large and intimidating in the quiet lobby. One of them, a younger man with a crew cut and nervous eyes, looked uncertain, glancing between Thomas and Gerald as though trying to understand exactly what was happening. The other guard, older and more seasoned, simply took hold of Thomas's left arm with a firm grip. "Sir, we need you to come with us," the older guard said, his voice not unkind but absolutely unyielding. Thomas looked up at him, then at the other guard who had taken his right arm, and something in his expression shifted. It wasn't anger or fear, but a deep, profound sadness. The look of a man who had been in this position before, who understood that there were moments when dignity was the only possession that couldn't be taken away no matter what else was stripped from you. "I have an appointment," he said one more time, his voice barely above a whisper now. "My daughter is expecting me. She's going to wonder where I am." Gerald made a sharp gesture toward the doors. "Remove him," he ordered. Now, the guards began to walk, and Thomas had no choice but to move with them, their hands tight on his arms. Sarah made a sound of protest, starting forward, but Gerald held up a warning hand that stopped her in her tracks. The entire lobby watched in silence as the elderly homeless man was led across the marble floor, his taped shoes making soft sounds with each step, his worn canvas bag clutched in one hand while the other arm was held by a security guard. Heads turned to follow his progress, and though the faces watching showed a range of emotions from pity to approval to carefully studied neutrality, not one person stood up, not one person spoke out, not one person moved to intervene. Gerald straightened his red tie once more and addressed the watching crowd with calm authority. "I apologize for the disturbance," he said, his voice smooth and professional once again. "Please rest assured that Street Catherine's takes the comfort and safety of our patients very seriously. We maintain strict protocols to ensure that everyone who enters this facility belongs here and can be properly served by our staff. Thank you for your patience." The security guards moved Thomas forward with steady pressure, their grips on his arms firm but not brutal, as professional, in their execution of an order they had been given by someone whose authority they had no reason to question. Thomas did not fight them, did not struggle or pull against their hold. but simply walked between them with his head held high, his blue eyes fixed straight ahead, looking neither left nor right at the faces that watched his expulsion from this place of healing that had refused to heal him. His steps were slow and measured, hampered slightly by his worn shoes and the weight of years. But there was something unbroken in the way he carried himself, a core of dignity that even this public humiliation could not touch. Sarah stood rooted to the spot where Gerald had stopped her, her hands pressed against her mouth now as tears streamed down her face, watching helplessly as the old man was marched toward the doors. She wanted to run after him, to shout that this was wrong, that someone needed to check the appointment system, that Dr. Wright needed to be called immediately, but Gerald's threat hung over her like a sword, and she was young enough and new enough to this job that the fear of losing it kept her frozen in place, hating herself for her silence but unable to break it. Gerald, meanwhile, had turned to address the assembled patients and staff once more, his voice taking on the tone of a man delivering an important message, a leader explaining a difficult decision to those who depended on his judgment. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, moving to stand in the center of the lobby where everyone could see him clearly, his red tie brilliant against his charcoal suit. "What you've just witnessed is an unfortunate but necessary part of maintaining the standards that make Street Catherine's the institution it is. We live in a time when boundaries are constantly being tested, when people believe they can go anywhere and demand anything regardless of their circumstances or their ability to pay for services." He paused, letting his words sink in, his expression grave and righteous. "But we have a responsibility," he continued, "not just to our bottom line but to you, our valued patients who have chosen Street Catherine's because of our reputation for excellence. You come here expecting a certain environment, a certain level of care, a certain assurance that you will be surrounded by others who share your commitment to quality healthcare. When we allow that environment to be compromised, when we permit individuals who clearly cannot afford our services or who may have mental health issues or substance abuse problems to occupy our waiting areas, we put all of that at risk." Several heads nodded in the audience, and Gerald's confidence grew visibly. "This is not about being cruel," he said, his voice softening slightly, as though to demonstrate his compassion. "This is about being realistic. There are many excellent facilities in this city designed specifically to serve the homeless population, places with the resources and expertise to handle their unique needs. By directing that gentleman to those appropriate venues, we are actually helping him get the care he truly requires while simultaneously protecting the experience we've promised to you, our community of patients who make Street Catherine's possible through your support and your loyalty." At the revolving doors, the security guards were positioning Thomas to push him through, one guard reaching forward to start the door spinning, while the other maintained his grip on the old man's arm. Thomas took one last look back over his shoulder at the lobby, at the gleaming marble and the crystal chandelier and the watching faces, and in that moment, something in his expression spoke of a loss far deeper than just a missed appointment, a sadness that encompassed all the times he had been judged, dismissed, cast out from places because of how he looked rather than who he was. The guard pushed him forward, and as Thomas stumbled slightly trying to keep his balance while moving through the rotating door, his grip on his canvas bag loosened, and his worn wallet, which he had been trying to show to Gerald just minutes before, slipped from where he had tucked it back into his coat pocket. The wallet hit the marble floor with a soft sound, and its contents exploded outward, papers scattering across the polished surface like leaves in wind. An insurance card slid several feet to the left. A folded piece of paper that might have been an appointment confirmation landed near the reception desk. A photograph, old and creased, came to rest face up, showing a much younger Thomas in a military uniform, standing next to a woman with kind eyes and a bright smile. Several other documents spread out in a rough circle, each one potentially holding proof of exactly what Thomas had been trying to tell them. Gerald glanced down at the scattered papers with irritation crossing his features, seeing them as nothing more than clutter marring the perfect floor of his lobby. Without breaking stride, without even bending to look at what had fallen, he simply kicked at the nearest papers with one expensive Italian leather shoe, sending them skittering further across the marble toward the wall where they would be out of the way. The contempt in the gesture was absolute. A final dismissal not just of Thomas but of anything he might have had to say or prove, and several people in the watching crowd drew in sharp breaths at the casual cruelty of it. The security guards completed their task, pushing Thomas through the revolving doors and out onto the street beyond. And the doors spun closed behind him with a soft whoosh of displaced air, sealing him on the outside while everyone else remained safe and comfortable within. 2 hours and 17 minutes after Thomas Wright had been pushed through the revolving doors of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital, Dr. Elizabeth Wright walked through those same doors with the exhausted but satisfied air of a surgeon who had just saved a life. She had spent the last 6 hours at Mercy General across town, called in for an emergency consultation on a complex aortic dissection that had required her very specific expertise, and she had scrubbed in immediately to assist with a procedure that had ultimately been successful despite the odds being stacked against them. Now she was back at St. Catherine's, her home base, ready to resume her scheduled appointments and catch up on the administrative work that never seemed to end. Elizabeth was 47 years old, tall and lean, with her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades mastering her craft. She wore no makeup, had no jewelry except for a simple watch with a practical band, and her clothing under her white coat was nothing more than wrinkled surgical scrubs that she hadn't bothered to change out of after leaving Mercy General. She was the kind of doctor who cared about results rather than appearances, about skill rather than status. And while she was universally respected by her colleagues and beloved by her patients, she had never quite fit into the culture of exclusivity that St. Catherine's had cultivated under administrators like Gerald Hutchinson. As she crossed the lobby, several staff members greeted her with warm smiles and respectful nods, and she returned each greeting with genuine warmth, taking a moment to ask a resident about his mother's recovery and complimenting a nurse on her handling of a difficult case the previous week. She pulled her phone from her coat pocket as she walked, intending to check her messages, and her brow furrowed as she noticed 3 missed calls from an unknown number that had come in over the past 2 hours. The number had a local area code, and whoever had called had not left a voicemail, which struck her as odd. A small knot of worry formed in her stomach, the kind of instinctive concern that came from years of waiting for bad news, of knowing that unexpected calls often meant something had gone wrong. She was still looking at her phone when she reached the main reception desk, and she glanced up at Jennifer, the receptionist who had been working at St. Catherine's for nearly a decade. "Jennifer," she said, offering a tired smile, "I got called away to Mercy for an emergency, and I think I missed my 2 o'clock appointment. Can you tell me if Thomas Wright checked in? I tried to call him to let him know I was running late, but I couldn't reach him." Jennifer's face underwent an immediate and dramatic transformation, the professional pleasantness draining away to be replaced by something that looked very much like fear. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened slightly, and a flush crept up her neck as she glanced quickly toward the administrative offices on the 2nd floor, as though hoping to find help there. "Dr. Wright," she began, her voice wavering slightly, and then she stopped, clearly struggling to find the right words. Elizabeth's smile faded, replaced by concern and a growing sense that something was very wrong. "Jennifer, what is it?" she asked, her voice sharpening with the authority of someone used to dealing with emergencies. "Did Thomas not show up? Is he all right?" Jennifer twisted her hands together beneath the desk where Elizabeth couldn't see them, her discomfort now radiating from her in almost visible waves. She started, then stopped again, swallowing hard. "Dr. Wright, I think you need to speak with Sarah Mitchell. She's in the emergency department. There was an incident this afternoon with your appointment, and Sarah was there, and I think she can explain better than I can." The knot in Elizabeth's stomach pulled tighter, transforming from vague worry into sharp alarm. Elizabeth didn't wait for Jennifer to say anything more. She turned on her heel and strode toward the emergency department with quick, purposeful steps, her white coat billowing behind her, and the staff members who saw her face as she passed instinctively moved out of her way, recognizing the expression of someone who had just received very bad news and was operating on pure professional control. She found Sarah in the emergency department break room, sitting alone at a table with her head in her hands. And when the young nurse looked up at the sound of the door opening and saw Dr. Wright standing there, her face crumpled and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Dr. Wright," Sarah said, her voice breaking on the words. "I'm so sorry. I tried to stop it. I tried to tell them, but he wouldn't listen. And I was scared I'd lose my job. And I should have done more. I should have called you directly. I should have refused to let them take him." Elizabeth crossed the room in 3 quick strides and sat down across from Sarah, her movements controlled but her eyes blazing with an intensity that made the younger woman flinch. "Sarah," she said, her voice level but carrying an undercurrent of something dangerous. "Tell me exactly what happened. Who wouldn't listen? Who took who? Where is Thomas Wright?" Sarah took a shuddering breath and began to speak, the words tumbling out in a rush as though she had been holding them back for too long, and they were burning her from the inside. "He came for his 2 o'clock appointment," she said. "He was so polite, so dignified, even though it was obvious he was homeless and probably hadn't eaten in days. He had his intake forms. He said he had an appointment with you. He said his daughter had arranged everything. I was helping him fill out the paperwork. And then Hutchinson came down from his office." Sarah's voice grew thick with emotion as she continued, describing Gerald's interrogation, his condescending questions, his refusal to believe that Thomas had a legitimate appointment. She described how he had called security, how Thomas had tried to show his documentation, but Gerald had physically stopped him, how the old man had been marched across the lobby in front of everyone, while Gerald made a speech about maintaining standards. Her hands trembled as she spoke, and her voice dropped to barely above a whisper when she described the final moment. The wallet falling, the papers scattering, Gerald kicking them aside like garbage. Elizabeth's face had gone very pale, and her jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles stood out in sharp relief. Her hands, which had been resting flat on the table, slowly curled into fists, and when she spoke her voice was so cold and so controlled that it was somehow more frightening than if she had screamed. "Gerald Hutchinson did this," she said, and it was not a question but a statement of fact that needed to be confirmed. Sarah nodded miserably. "Yes, Dr. Wright. He ordered security to remove your patient. He said people like that didn't belong at St. Catherine's. He said there was no way you would have a personal appointment with someone who was homeless. He wouldn't even check the system. He just—" She paused, wiping at her tears. "He just threw him out like he was nothing." Elizabeth's hands were shaking now, a fine tremor that she couldn't control, and she pulled her phone from her pocket with movements that seemed to require enormous effort. "Where is he now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Where did they take him?" "I don't know," Sarah whispered. "They put him out on the street. That was 2 hours ago. He could be anywhere. Dr. Wright, I'm so sorry. I know he was your patient, and this should never have happened to anyone, but especially not to someone you were trying to help." Elizabeth's fingers moved across her phone screen, and she pulled up her photos, scrolling back through images until she found the one she was looking for. Her hand shook harder as she turned the phone around to show Sarah, and on the screen was a photograph of Thomas Wright, the same man who had been thrown out of the hospital, but in this photo he was cleaner, his hair trimmed, wearing donated clothes that fit him properly, and he was smiling at the camera, with those kind blue eyes crinkled at the corners. He was standing next to Elizabeth in the photo, her arm around his shoulders, and the love between them was evident in every line of their postures. "Sarah," Elizabeth said, and her voice finally cracked, the professional control shattering to reveal the raw anguish beneath. "This is my father. Thomas Wright is my father." Sarah's face went white, and her mouth opened in a silent O of horror. Elizabeth set the phone down on the table with exaggerated care, as though afraid that if she wasn't careful she might crush it or throw it across the room. "He's been homeless for 3 years, Elizabeth continued, each word seeming to cost her something. "After my mother died, he fell apart, lost everything. I've been trying to find him, to help him, for so long. He finally called me 3 weeks ago, finally agreed to let me help. This appointment, this was supposed to be the beginning. Medical care first, then housing, then therapy. This was supposed to be the day we started putting his life back together." Her hands were shaking so hard now that she had to press them flat against the table, and Gerald Hutchinson threw him out into the street. Elizabeth pressed her palms against the cool surface of the table, using the physical sensation to anchor herself, to keep from falling apart completely in front of Sarah, and when she began to speak again, her voice was thick with emotion, but steady, the voice of someone who had learned through years of delivering bad news to families that sometimes the only way through pain was to walk straight into it with your eyes open. "My father wasn't always homeless," she said quietly. 20 years ago, he was one of the most respected men in our community. He served 2 tours in Vietnam, came home with medals for valor, and never talked about what he'd seen over there except to say that he'd done his duty, and he was grateful to have survived when so many of his friends hadn't. He worked as a high school guidance counselor for 30 years, helping kids figure out their futures, writing college recommendation letters, talking teenagers down from suicide ledges, doing all the invisible work that holds communities together. Sarah listened in silence, her tears still flowing, but her attention completely focused on Elizabeth's words. "He married my mother when he was 25. Elizabeth continued, and a small smile ghosted across her face at the memory. "Catherine. They met at a church social, and he told me once that he knew within 5 minutes of talking to her that she was the person he wanted to spend his life with. They were married for 43 years. 43 years of the kind of partnership you read about in books but rarely see in real life. They finished each other's sentences. They never went to bed angry. They volunteered together at the homeless shelter every Thanksgiving, which is," her voice caught slightly, "an irony that's not lost on me now." The smile faded, replaced by something darker. "My mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 4 years ago," Elizabeth said. "She was gone within 6 months. It was fast, and it was brutal. And my father, he just—" She paused, searching for the right words. "He shattered. That's the only way I can describe it. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. He couldn't sleep in their bed anymore because she wasn't there. He couldn't eat the foods she used to cook. He stopped going to work, stopped answering phone calls, stopped participating in all the community activities that had defined his life. I tried to help him, Sarah. God knows I tried. I called every day. I visited as often as my schedule allowed. I begged him to move in with me, to see a therapist, to take medication for the depression that was clearly consuming him. But grief doesn't follow a logical path. And my father's grief was the kind that destroys everything in its path." Elizabeth's hands had stopped shaking now, but her knuckles were white where she pressed them against the table. "Within a year, he had lost the house," she continued. "He couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments after he lost his job. And he wouldn't let me help financially. He had some kind of pride about it, some belief that accepting money from his daughter would be a failure on his part. He moved into a cheaper apartment, then a cheaper one after that. He started drinking. Not heavily, but enough to blur the edges of his pain. And then, one day, about 3 years ago, he just disappeared." Elizabeth looked up at Sarah, and the anguish in her eyes was raw and unfiltered. "I came to his apartment and all his things were gone. No note, no forwarding address, no phone number. I filed missing persons reports. I hired private investigators. I drove through every neighborhood in this city looking for him, showing his photo to people on the streets, checking every shelter, every soup kitchen, every place where the homeless gather, and I found nothing. He didn't want to be found." Sarah reached across the table and took Elizabeth's hand, a simple gesture of comfort that the doctor accepted gratefully. 3 weeks ago," Elizabeth continued, her voice stronger now, "I got a phone call from an unknown number. It was him. His voice was rough, older, but it was definitely him. He said he'd been thinking about me, about Mom, about everything he'd lost. He said he wasn't ready to come home, wasn't ready to face everything he'd run away from. But he was tired, tired of being cold, tired of being hungry, tired of being invisible. He had this cough that wouldn't go away, and it scared him enough to reach out." A single tear rolled down Elizabeth's cheek, and she didn't bother to wipe it away. "We talked for 2 hours that first call," she said. "And then he called again the next day, and the day after that. Slowly, carefully. We started rebuilding something between us. I didn't push. I didn't demand that he come home immediately, or that he explain where he'd been or what he'd been doing. I just listened. And when he finally said he was ready to accept help, I told him we'd take it one step at a time. Medical care first. Because that cough worried me, and I needed to know he was physically okay. Then we'd work on housing, on therapy, on all the other pieces. Elizabeth looked down at her phone, at the photo of her and her father that still glowed on the screen. "This appointment today," she said softly. "This was supposed to be our new beginning, the first step in bringing him home." And instead, Gerald Hutchinson threw him back out into the cold. Elizabeth stood from the table in the emergency department break room with a movement so abrupt that her chair scraped loudly against the floor. And Sarah flinched at the sound. "Dr. Wright," Sarah began, but Elizabeth was already moving toward the door, her white coat swirling behind her. Her face set in an expression of such cold fury that Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Elizabeth moved through the hospital corridors with long, purposeful strides, and the staff members who saw her approaching stepped quickly out of her path, recognizing in her body language something dangerous and unstoppable. She took the stairs to the second floor, 2 at a time, bypassing the elevator entirely, and when she reached the administrative wing, she didn't pause at Gerald's assistant's desk or knock on his closed door, but simply pushed it open with enough force that it banged against the interior wall. Gerald looked up from his computer with an expression of irritation that shifted to surprise when he saw who had entered his domain uninvited. "Dr. Wright," he said, rising from his chair with the air of someone determined to reassert control over a situation that had become irregular. "I wasn't aware we had a meeting scheduled. If you need to discuss something, I'd appreciate it if you'd make an appointment through my assistant rather than barging into my office." Elizabeth closed the door behind her with exaggerated care, the quiet click of the latch somehow more ominous than if she had slammed it, and when she turned to face Gerald, her eyes were blazing with an intensity that made him take an involuntary step backward. "You threw my father out of this hospital," she said, her voice low and controlled, but vibrating with barely suppressed rage. "You had security drag him through the lobby like a criminal and push him out onto the street." Gerald's face showed confusion, his brow wrinkling as he tried to process what she was saying. "Dr. Wright, I have no idea what you're talking about," he replied, his tone shifting toward condescension as though he were dealing with someone who had become inexplicably emotional. "I haven't had any interactions with your family. Perhaps you've confused me with someone else. Or perhaps there's been some kind of misunderstanding. 2 hours ago," Elizabeth said, each word precise and cutting, "an elderly homeless man came to this hospital for a 2 o'clock appointment. His name was Thomas Wright. He was my patient. He was my father. And you threw him out without even bothering to verify his appointment." Gerald's expression flickered, and something like recognition began to dawn in his eyes, but he still hadn't grasped the full magnitude of what he'd done. "The homeless man," he said slowly, and his voice took on a defensive edge. "Dr. Wright, if that individual was claiming to be your father, then I'm even more confident that my decision was correct. He was clearly experiencing some kind of delusion or attempting to manipulate the system. I was protecting the hospital's reputation and your reputation by extension. No physician of your stature would have a father living on the streets. It's simply not credible." The expression on Elizabeth's face could have frozen fire, and when she spoke, her voice was so cold that Gerald actually shivered. "You don't get to decide what's credible about my family," she said. "You don't get to make assumptions about my life based on your narrow, privileged worldview. Thomas Wright is my father. He's a decorated Vietnam veteran who served his country with honor. He's a man who spent 30 years helping teenagers find their way in life. And he's someone who fell apart after my mother died and ended up homeless because grief doesn't care about your credentials or your past achievements." Gerald's face had begun to drain of color, the confident smugness sliding away to be replaced by dawning horror as the full implications of what she was saying sank in. He started, but Elizabeth cut him off with a sharp gesture. "You didn't check the appointment system," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You didn't call my office. You didn't take 5 seconds to verify his story before you decided based purely on his appearance, that he was lying. You humiliated him in front of a lobby full of people. You physically prevented him from showing you the documentation he was trying to show you. And then you had him thrown out like trash. Gerald's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, and his hand moved automatically to his red tie, that habitual gesture of reassertion. But his fingers fumbled at the silk. "Dr. Wright," he finally managed, his voice shaking slightly. "I was following protocol. I was protecting the hospital's interests. We have standards. And this facility caters to a specific clientele. I couldn't have known that he was actually—" He stopped, realizing too late how his words sounded. "Standards," Elizabeth repeated, and the word dripped with contempt. "You mean the standards that say poor people don't deserve medical care? The standards that say you can judge someone's worth by their clothing? The standards that say homeless people should be kicked to the curb without basic human dignity?" She leaned forward, her hands flat on his desk. "My father is a human being, Gerald. He's sick. He's vulnerable. And he finally, after 3 years of living on the streets, found the courage to ask for help. And you destroyed that. You took what might have been his last chance to come home, and you crushed it under your expensive Italian shoes." Elizabeth pulled her phone from her coat pocket with hands that had steadied now that she had a clear course of action, now that the shock and anguish had crystallized into something focused and purposeful. Gerald watched with growing alarm as she scrolled through her contacts, his face having gone from pale to gray, understanding beginning to break over him like a cold wave. "Dr. Wright," he said, his voice taking on a pleading quality that hadn't been there moments before. "Please, let's discuss this rationally. I made a judgment call based on the information I had available at the time. Surely you can understand that I was trying to protect the hospital's interests." Elizabeth didn't even look at him as she placed the call, and when the voice on the other end answered, she spoke with crisp, professional authority. "Margaret, this is Elizabeth Wright. I need an emergency meeting of the board of directors." "Yes, immediately. We have a situation that requires immediate action, and I'm invoking my authority as chief of cardiology to demand their attention." There was a pause as she listened, and then her voice grew harder. "A member of our administrative staff threw my father out of the hospital today. He was a patient with a scheduled appointment, and he was forcibly removed by security because he's homeless." Gerald Hutchinson made the decision. "I'm in his office now, and I'm telling you that if he's not suspended within the next 10 minutes, I'm resigning and taking this to every media outlet in the city." Another pause, shorter this time, and then Elizabeth nodded once. "Thank you. I'll be waiting for confirmation." She ended the call and finally looked at Gerald, who had sunk back into his chair as though his legs would no longer support him. His hands trembled on the armrests, and his red tie seemed suddenly too bright against his pale face, like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. "You can't do this," he said weakly. "I've worked at this hospital for 15 years. I've built its reputation. One mistake, one misunderstanding. You can't destroy my career over this." Elizabeth's expression didn't soften even slightly. "You didn't make a mistake, Gerald," she said coldly. "You made a choice. You chose to judge a human being based on his appearance. You chose to humiliate him publicly. You chose to ignore his attempts to provide documentation. And you chose to physically remove him from a place of healing because he didn't fit your image of what our patients should look like. Those weren't mistakes. Those were decisions that reveal exactly who you are." Her phone buzzed with a text message, and she glanced at it briefly. "The board has voted," she said. "You're suspended effective immediately pending a full investigation. Margaret Chen is on her way here now. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings." Gerald's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked almost as lost as Thomas had looked when the security guards had gripped his arms. "This is my life," he whispered. "This hospital is everything I've built." Elizabeth turned toward the door, then paused and looked back at him over her shoulder. "My father's life was destroyed by grief," she said quietly. "Yours is being destroyed by your own cruelty. I know which one I have more sympathy for." She left his office without another word, pulling the door closed behind her, and immediately placed another call. This time to the city's homeless outreach coordinator, describing her father and asking them to alert all their street teams to look for him. She called the police non-emergency line and filed a report. She called every shelter within a 5-mile radius. Each conversation was brief and efficient. The actions of someone who had learned long ago that in emergencies you either fell apart or you started solving problems. And Elizabeth had always been a solver. Within 20 minutes, Margaret Chen arrived at the hospital, the CEO moving through the building with the same kind of purposeful energy that Elizabeth had shown earlier. Margaret was 62 years old, elegant and sharp, and she found Elizabeth in her office making yet another phone call. When Elizabeth ended the call, Margaret closed the office door and sat down across from her with an expression of genuine distress. "Elizabeth," she said simply, "I'm so sorry. This should never have happened. I've already initiated a full review of our policies and procedures, and Gerald Hutchinson will not be making decisions for this hospital again." Meanwhile, in the administrative wing, 2 security guards had arrived at Gerald's office with the same professional courtesy they had shown when dealing with Thomas, though the irony of the situation was lost on neither the guards nor Gerald himself. The older guard, the same one who had gripped Thomas's arm just hours before, stood in the doorway with an uncomfortable expression as Gerald slowly gathered his personal items from his desk. His hands shook as he packed his nameplate, his coffee mug with the hospital logo, the framed certifications that lined his walls. When he finally emerged from his office carrying a cardboard box of belongings, he had to walk the same path through the administrative wing that Thomas had walked through the lobby, and staff members emerged from their offices to watch him pass. Some faces showed satisfaction, a sense that justice was being served. Others showed concern or even sympathy, aware that careers could be fragile things and that anyone could fall from grace given the right circumstances. But all of them watched in silence, and Gerald walked with his head down, his red tie hanging loose now around his neck, his expensive suit somehow looking shabby and worn as he made his way toward the elevator that would take him down to the lobby and out through those same revolving doors that had closed behind Thomas Wright just 2 hours before. Elizabeth found her father at the Gray Street shelter, 6 blocks from Street Catherine's, a squat brick building that served hot meals twice a day and provided emergency beds for those who had nowhere else to go. The outreach coordinator had called her within 40 minutes of her initial plea for help, saying that a man matching Thomas's description had been seen entering the shelter around 3 in the afternoon, and Elizabeth had left the hospital immediately, not bothering to change out of her scrubs or even grab her coat despite the autumn chill in the air. She burst through the shelter's front door with enough urgency that the volunteer at the desk jumped in surprise. And when Elizabeth identified herself and explained who she was looking for, the volunteer's expression softened with understanding, and she gestured toward the common room where residents sat at scattered tables, eating an early dinner. Thomas was seated alone in the corner farthest from the door, a tray of untouched food in front of him, his canvas bag clutched on his lap as though he was ready to flee at any moment. He stared at the table surface with those kind blue eyes that now held a depth of sadness that made Elizabeth's heart shatter all over again. When she spoke his name, barely above a whisper, he looked up, and the expression that crossed his face was so complex, so layered with relief and shame and love and despair, that she couldn't breathe for a moment. "Dad," she said again. And then she was moving across the room and he was standing, and they came together in an embrace that felt like coming home after years of wandering lost in the wilderness. Thomas was thin beneath his layers of clothing, frailer than she remembered from their last meeting 3 weeks ago, and she held him carefully as though afraid he might break. "I'm so sorry," Elizabeth said into his shoulder, her voice muffled against the worn fabric of his coat. "I'm so sorry for what happened. I should have been there. I should have warned the staff. I should have made sure everyone knew you were coming. This is my fault." Thomas pulled back slightly, his weathered hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that brought fresh tears to her eyes. "No, Lizzie," he said, using the childhood nickname he hadn't spoken in years. "This isn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. You tried to help me, and I—" He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "I almost didn't come back. After they threw me out, after that man looked at me like I was garbage, I remembered why I stopped asking for help in the first place. It's easier to be invisible than to be seen and judged and found wanting." Elizabeth gripped his hands tightly, feeling the calluses and the cold that seemed to live permanently in his skin. "You're not garbage," she said fiercely. "You're not invisible. You're my father, and you're sick and you need help, and I'm not going to let what one cruel man did keep you from getting the care you need. The hospital is different now. That man is gone. Please, Dad, please come back with me. Let me help you. We'll do this right this time." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the war playing out behind his eyes, the part of him that wanted to accept warring with the part that had learned to expect rejection and humiliation at every turn. When Thomas walked back through the revolving doors of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital with Elizabeth at his side, the lobby fell into a hush that was completely different from the one that had accompanied his expulsion just hours before. Where before there had been uncomfortable silence mixed with judgment and approval of his removal, now there was a palpable sense of collective shame, an awareness that something deeply wrong had occurred within these walls, and that everyone who had witnessed it bore some measure of responsibility for not speaking up. Margaret Chen herself was waiting in the lobby, and she approached Thomas with genuine humility written across her features, extending her hand and introducing herself as the hospital's chief executive officer. "Mr. Wright," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet space. "On behalf of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital, I offer you my sincerest apologies for the unconscionable treatment you received today. What happened to you violated every principle of care and dignity that this institution is supposed to stand for, and I want you to know that we are taking immediate action to ensure nothing like this ever happens again." Thomas accepted her handshake with quiet dignity, though Elizabeth could feel the tension in his body, the readiness to flee that still hummed beneath his calm exterior. Several staff members approached as well, including Sarah, whose face was blotched from crying. She couldn't speak at first, could only mouth the words "I'm sorry" over and over until Thomas reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "You tried to help me," he said softly. "You were kind when kindness cost you something. Thank you." The medical evaluation that followed was thorough and conducted with a level of care that bordered on reverence, as though every doctor and nurse who participated wanted to somehow atone for what had been done. Thomas was given a private examination room, offered clean hospital scrubs to change into so his clothes could be laundered, provided with a hot meal that he ate slowly while Elizabeth sat beside him holding his hand. The persistent cough that had worried him turned out to be bronchitis complicated by mild pneumonia, treatable with antibiotics and rest, though the chest x-rays also revealed the beginning stages of emphysema from years of exposure to cold and damp conditions. Elizabeth arranged for him to be admitted overnight for observation and to ensure the antibiotics began working, and she stayed with him as he was settled into a private room on the hospital's quietest floor, a space usually reserved for VIP patients and major donors. Meanwhile, in the parking garage beneath the hospital, Gerald Hutchinson sat in his luxury sedan with the cardboard box of his belongings on the passenger seat beside him, staring at nothing through the windshield. He had been sitting there for over an hour, unable to bring himself to start the engine and drive away, unable to face going home to his expensive house in the suburbs and explaining to his wife what had happened. The suspension letter from the board of directors sat on top of the items in the box, the formal language detailing the accusations against him and informing him that his access to hospital systems had been revoked pending the outcome of a full investigation. His hands rested on the steering wheel, and he noticed distantly that they were shaking, a fine tremor that he couldn't seem to control. He kept replaying the scene from the lobby in his mind, seeing Thomas Wright's weathered face and kind eyes, hearing his own voice raised in that condescending tone, watching himself kick aside those scattered papers without even looking at what they contained. He thought about all the times over the years he had made similar judgments, had assessed people based on their appearance and decided they didn't belong at St. Catherine's, had prided himself on maintaining standards and protecting the hospital's exclusive image. He had genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. had convinced himself that there was a natural order to the world and that part of his job was to enforce that order, to keep the wealthy and powerful separate from those who had failed to achieve success. But now, sitting alone in the dim light of the parking garage, he was forced to confront a question he had never allowed himself to ask before. What if he had been wrong? What if the standards he had spent 15 years maintaining were not actually about excellence, but about cruelty? What if protecting the hospital's image had really just been a socially acceptable way to exercise prejudice and maintain systems that kept certain people in their place while elevating others based solely on their ability to pay? He thought about Thomas Wright's dignified bearing, even as he was being dragged across the marble floor, the way he had tried to show documentation, the calm insistence that he had an appointment and a right to be there. Gerald had dismissed all of that, had refused to see the humanity in front of him because it was wrapped in tattered clothing and unwashed skin. He had seen only what he expected to see, had filled in the blanks with his own assumptions and prejudices, and in doing so, he had committed an act of violence against another human being. The realization settled over him like a weight, heavy and inescapable. 6 months passed, with the steady rhythm of seasons changing. Autumn giving way to winter, and then to the first tentative warmth of spring. And in that time, both St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital and Gerald Hutchinson underwent transformations that would have seemed impossible on that October afternoon when Thomas Wright had been thrown out into the cold. Gerald had spent the first month of his suspension in a kind of stunned paralysis, moving through his days like a ghost, while the investigation proceeded and the board of directors deliberated his fate. But somewhere in the darkness of that period, somewhere between the sleepless nights and the difficult conversations with his wife about who he had become, Gerald made a choice to actually change rather than simply wait for the storm to pass. He enrolled in sensitivity training programs that went far beyond the hospital's requirements, sitting through sessions on implicit bias and systemic discrimination, with the humility of someone who had finally recognized how much he didn't know. He began volunteering at the Grace Street shelter where Elizabeth had found her father, serving meals and listening to stories from people he once would have dismissed without a second thought. He worked with homeless outreach programs, walking the same streets where Thomas had lived for 3 years. And with each person he met, he tried to see past the surface to the complex human being beneath, tried to unlearn the prejudices that had been so deeply ingrained in his worldview. When the board finally concluded their investigation, they offered Gerald a choice: resign permanently, with a neutral reference, or return to St. Catherine's in a dramatically reduced capacity with the understanding that he would never again hold administrative authority over patient access. He chose to return, accepting a position as patient advocate, a role that put him in direct contact with the vulnerable and underserved populations he had once worked so hard to exclude. St. Catherine's itself had changed as well under Margaret Chen's determined leadership. New policies had been implemented requiring that every person who entered seeking care be treated with dignity regardless of their appearance or perceived ability to pay. Training programs on unconscious bias became mandatory for all staff. The hospital established a fund to provide care for indigent patients, and they partnered with local homeless services to create a medical outreach program that brought doctors and nurses to the streets rather than waiting for the most vulnerable to find their way to hospital doors. It was on a bright Tuesday morning in April that Gerald encountered Thomas Wright in the hospital's main lobby, and for a moment he almost didn't recognize the man whose life he had so profoundly disrupted 6 months earlier. Thomas looked healthy now, his face fuller and his color good, his hair neatly trimmed and his clothing clean and well-fitting. He wore a volunteer badge clipped to his shirt and was guiding an elderly woman in a wheelchair toward the cardiology department, speaking to her in gentle, reassuring tones about the procedure she was scheduled for that afternoon. Gerald stopped walking, frozen by the sight, and felt his heart begin to pound in his chest with a mixture of shame and fear and something that might have been hope. Thomas completed his task, saw the woman safely delivered to the nurse's station, and turned to head back toward the volunteer office when his eyes fell on Gerald, standing motionless in the middle of the corridor. Their gazes met and held, and for a long moment neither man moved or spoke. Then Thomas walked slowly toward him, and Gerald had to force himself not to step backward not to flee from the reckoning he knew he deserved. "Mr. Wright," Gerald said, his voice emerging rough and uncertain. "Thomas, if I may. He paused, struggling to find words adequate to the enormity of what he needed to say. "I owe you an apology. Those words don't come close to being enough, but I need to say them. What I did to you 6 months ago was cruel and wrong. I judged you based on your appearance. I refused to see your humanity. I humiliated you and had you thrown out when you came here seeking help and healing. There's no excuse for my behavior, and I've spent every day since then trying to understand how I became someone capable of treating another person that way." Thomas listened without interrupting, his kind blue eyes steady on Gerald's face, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm and thoughtful. "I forgive you, Mr. Hutchinson," Thomas said simply. Gerald's eyes widened with surprise, and Thomas continued, "I don't say that because what you did was acceptable or because it didn't hurt me, because it did hurt, more than you probably know. But I've learned something in my years on the streets and in my months of recovery. People can change. Circumstances can change. The man I was before my wife died, the guidance counselor who helped teenagers find their path, he wouldn't have recognized the man I became when grief broke me. And the man you were that day, so certain of your judgments and your right to exclude people, that's not the man I see standing in front of me now." Gerald felt tears prick at his eyes, and he didn't try to hide them. "Thank you," he whispered. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but thank you." Thomas smiled then, a gentle expression that transformed his weathered face. "We all deserve the chance to be better than our worst moments," he said. "That's what my daughter taught me when she refused to give up on finding me. That's what this hospital is trying to learn. And maybe, Gerald, that's what you're learning too." The changes that began on that October afternoon when Thomas Wright was thrown out of St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital rippled outward in ways that no one could have predicted, transforming not just individual lives but the very culture of an institution that had prided itself on exclusivity for far too long. The most visible symbol of that transformation was the Thomas Wright Fund for Indigent Care, established by the Board of Directors, with an initial endowment of $5 million and sustained by ongoing contributions from grateful patients and community members who had heard the story of what had happened and wanted to ensure it never happened again. The fund provided comprehensive medical care to anyone who walked through St. Catherine's doors, regardless of their ability to pay, and it supported the hospital's expanded outreach programs that brought health care directly to homeless encampments and shelters throughout the city. Thomas himself had been deeply moved when Margaret Chen had asked his permission to name the fund after him, and though he had initially protested that he didn't deserve such recognition, Elizabeth had convinced him that his story had the power to change lives, and that allowing his name to be used was itself an act of service. The fund had treated over 200 patients in its first 6 months of operation, providing everything from basic urgent care to complex surgical procedures, and each person who received care through the program was treated with the same dignity and respect afforded to the hospital's wealthiest patients. Sarah Mitchell had been promoted to Director of Patient Experience, a newly created position that gave her authority to ensure that every interaction within the hospital reflected the values of compassion and human dignity that should have been there all along. She worked tirelessly to train staff on recognizing their own biases, on seeing past appearances to the person beneath, and she created systems to ensure that vulnerable patients had advocates within the hospital structure who would fight for their right to care. Her office was filled with thank you cards and letters from patients who had been treated with kindness when they expected judgment, and she kept one photo on her desk, a picture of Thomas in his volunteer vest standing beside Elizabeth in the cardiology department, both of them smiling at the camera, with the kind of joy that comes from hard-won healing. Thomas himself had undergone his own transformation during these 6 months, though his was quieter and more internal than the institutional changes happening around him. Elizabeth had helped him secure a small studio apartment in a safe neighborhood 3 blocks from her own house, a modest space with large windows that let in afternoon sunlight, and a kitchen where he could cook the simple meals he preferred. The apartment was furnished simply with donations and thrift store finds, But Thomas had made it his own with photographs of Catherine that he'd kept safe in his canvas bag through all his years on the streets, and with new photos of Elizabeth and himself that documented their journey back to each other. He had started attending grief counseling sessions twice a week, finally beginning to process the loss of his wife and the shame he felt about how completely he had fallen apart after her death. He volunteered at the hospital 3 days a week, using his decades of experience as a guidance counselor to comfort frightened patients and help them navigate the overwhelming complexity of medical treatment. His weathered face and kind eyes had become familiar fixtures in the cardiology department, and more than one patient had told Elizabeth that her father's presence had been the most healing part of their hospital experience. The story of what had happened that October afternoon had spread throughout the medical community and beyond, uncovered by local news outlets and eventually picked up by national media as an example of how institutional prejudice could exist, even in places dedicated to healing. But more importantly, it had become a teaching moment, a cautionary tale about the danger of judging human worth by external appearances and the devastating impact that one moment of cruelty could have on a vulnerable person's willingness to seek help. Hospital administrators across the country had reached out to Margaret Chen asking about Street Catherine's new policies and training programs, and slowly, incrementally, the ripples of change continued to spread. On a warm evening in late April, Elizabeth and Thomas sat together at the small table in his apartment, sharing a simple dinner of roasted chicken and vegetables that they had prepared together in his tiny kitchen. The windows were open to let in the spring breeze, and the sound of children playing in the courtyard below drifted up to them, along with the scent of blooming flowers from the community garden. They talked about small things, everyday things, the kind of comfortable conversation that comes from knowing someone completely and being known in return. Elizabeth told him about a complex surgery she had performed that morning, and Thomas told her about a young patient he had comforted in the waiting room, a teenager scared about his first cardiac procedure who had reminded Thomas of some of the students he had counseled years ago. As they cleared the dishes together and Thomas made tea the way Catherine used to make it, strong and sweet with a slice of lemon, Elizabeth looked at her father and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't realized had been unsettled for years. This was what healing looked like, she thought. Not dramatic or sudden, but quiet and persistent, built from thousands of small moments of choosing connection over isolation, forgiveness over bitterness, hope over despair. What had happened 6 months ago had been terrible and cruel, a moment when the worst of human nature had been on full display. But it had also revealed something essential about the capacity for change. One moment of cruelty could destroy. Yes, but one moment of reflection could rebuild. One person's willingness to truly see another person's humanity could start a chain reaction that transformed entire systems. Gerald Hutchinson's prejudice and Thomas Wright's humiliation had been real and devastating, but they had also become the catalyst for something better, for a hospital that finally lived up to its mission of healing all who entered its doors, for policies that protected the vulnerable instead of excluding them, for a community that had learned to value human dignity above appearance or status. As Thomas poured the tea and handed a cup to his daughter, as they sat together in the gentle light of early evening with the windows open and the future stretching out before them full of possibility, the lesson was clear without needing to be spoken aloud. Every person deserves to be seen, to be heard, to be treated with basic human respect, regardless of where they come from or what circumstances have brought them to your door. And when we fail to extend that respect, we diminish not just the other person, but ourselves and the institutions we build. But when we choose differently, when we choose compassion and dignity and the willingness to admit our mistakes and change our ways, we create the possibility for healing that extends far beyond any individual life and touches everyone who witnesses it, reminding us all that we are connected, that we are responsible for each other, and that it is never too late to choose kindness over cruelty, understanding over judgment, and love over fear.